It's Keir Starmer's first Labour Party conference as the Prime Minister, and there's plenty of work for him to do up here in Liverpool. We're going to be speaking to friends of the podcast, old and new, about what the key focuses are going to be, what pressures there are, and what will make a good or bad conference for the Labour Party.
Labour governments of the past took on this same challenge at a time when Britain desperately needed change. They deserved a better Britain when the odds were stacked against them. And that is exactly what this Labour government must deliver once again. So conference, let's get on with it.
Angela Rayner opened the conference to rapturous applause, but what will deem this event an actual success? Jim Murphy, former MP and Minister and now CEO of Arden Strategies, says it depends on the conversation that breaks out beyond it.
A conference works if it breaks out of the conference hall for a good reason. It's easy to get a conference to break out from the conference hall for terrible reasons. A controversy, a protest, a messed up speech, or whatever. But a conference that manages to get into people's living rooms or onto their phones or onto their social media feed, that's a success.
But for Times Radio journalist Hugo Rifkind, Starmer's goal will be to look like he's a natural when it comes to wielding the power that he has.
I think there is this sort of wave of, although Labour seems to be struggling in the polls, I think there's this sort of slight wave of relief across the country that in the sort of stewardship terms, Labour can be more trusted than what went before. I think there's a lot more wariness about the programme, what they're going to do, and they know there are fights on the horizon.
When you work hard, Labour will make sure you get your fair reward.
One of those fights is over the country's economy. A lack of detail had been a large criticism of the Labour government. Rachel Reeves' speech did reasonably little to fill in the blanks, despite the applause.
There was nothing substantive there, which is, I mean, you know, it's not long after an election, it's not long before a budget, so you can see why. But it is a bit weird doing your first big set-piece speech as the new Chancellor and really not giving us much to go on that we didn't know before.
So when it comes to the budget, what needs to be made clearer and what should we be looking out for in October? Zoe Billingham, director of the IPPR North think tank, says there are three key things.
Firstly, as I mentioned, it's so important that they link economic growth to where and who is benefiting. These are two sides of the same coin. You can't grow the economy over here and then expect to kind of sort out the distribution of who benefits later. So those two things have to go hand in hand. Secondly, those fiscal rules that I mentioned. So that's really the government saying to itself, what constraints will we put on ourselves as government? And, you know, there is a version of this where they could relax those fiscal rules so that that gives them more space to do investment at budget. And then thirdly, as I say, tax. I mean, it has to be, you know, the Chancellor's talked a lot about the 22 billion black hole that they inherited from the last government. And tax is going to have to be part of that solution.
Hannah Peaker, Director of Policy at the New Economics Foundation, told me the fiscal rules were worth noting too.
I think seeing her being determined about some of the aspects of their manifesto commitments, but also around not wanting a return to austerity is important. But right now is still rhetoric. And how you're going to do that if you are, you know, if you're going to stick to this arbitrary fiscal rule inherited from the Conservatives, which they changed many times themselves, which is binding you and limiting what you're able to do unnecessarily. You know, there's real consensus amongst a breadth of economists now that it's actually not a very good way of measuring safe levels of borrowing. And if she is saying, which she was very clearly, that what you need to ensure a better future is investment, you are going to have to think about how you're going to change those fiscal rules.
Away from the policy, a different talking point, a scandal, for want of a better phrase, has journalists chattering.
The free clothes thing is a big deal among journalists, a big deal among media. I think there's a sense of irritation that it's not landing harder, really, because a lot of it is quite reminiscent of the expenses scandal, in that you've got a lot of MPs on both parties going, this is just how it works, we all do it, it's fine, it must be fine, because if it wasn't fine, we wouldn't do it. And when they actually spell it out loud, like what someone pays for your birthday party, you know, and you took some tickets to see Taylor Swift because you really wanted to. You know, it's not a great excuse, and yet I don't get the sense that Labour, the government, are taking it very seriously. I don't even really get the sense that the public are taking it very seriously.
This might be being brushed off in some quarters, but there are questions on what it means for trust in politicians under Labour. I asked Tim Durant of the Institute for Government how this government is handling that.
Tim, when it comes to trust, then there's obviously been a bit of fuss around things like Frockgate and that sort of thing. How do you think this government is doing in terms of the job of rebuilding that trust among the public?
So we had a panel discussion with Lucy Powell about trust in politics yesterday, and obviously the sort of donations and the tickets came up and the dresses, and she made the point, which is totally true, that this is nothing compared to what was happening under the last government. You know, the dodgy loans for refurbishing the Downing Street flat, the parties during lockdown, you know, there was a whole, and the lobbying by MPs, there was a whole host of issues that were exposed through the last Parliament among Conservative MPs. And she made the point very forcefully that this is nothing like that, and I think that's totally true. I think the issue they have is twofold. One is, we're used to politics happening like that now. In the context of the last few years, trust is already so low that any little thing just makes people roll their eyes and say, oh, well, they're all the same, you know, these guys are no better than the last lot, which is difficult for the Labour Party. The second thing is, they made a huge deal out of all of the failings of the Conservatives. And so then to come in and, yes, they haven't broken any rules, but there's a sort of sense of, was this the right judgment? Were people really sort of thinking this through properly? How would it look to, you know, people out in the country that senior ministers are getting all of these freebies? And that sort of, you know, question of judgment, given how much pressure they put on the last government to uphold themselves to really high standards.
Way before July's election and throughout the campaign, Labour were flying high in the polls. But now they're in power, how do the numbers look?
Suddenly the polling on XYZ.
Patrick English is Director of Political Analytics at YouGov.
We're certainly seeing a wobble in the polls right now. Labour's favourability when they came into government was at a net of 0, which sounds bad, but actually, relative to most other parties and other politicians in the UK, 0 is quite good. In the weeks following, leading up to today, what we've noticed is that now has dropped to minus 20. So they've gone quite far in a negative direction in quite a small space of time. And that is a wobble, and I think it should be a bit worrying for Labour.
A record number of attendees flocked to Liverpool to hear Starmer's message, which he put across in his speech on Tuesday. He was unapologetic about needing to make tough decisions, but tried somewhat to offer a bit of hope.
People said we wouldn't win across Britain, but we did. People say we can't deliver national renewal, but we can and we will.
So will his pledge to change Britain alter people's opinions of him or the government? Journalist John Elledge isn't so sure.
I don't think it's going to shift the narrative. But like the narrative is kind of a bit weird at the moment. Like I've seen people try and argue like, you know, Starmer in crisis, and he's not. He's got a massive majority. He's in for the next 5 years. The next election is ages away. And I don't think, like, Labour may very well lose the next election. That's entirely possible. These are volatile times. But I don't think it'll be because they're having some teething problems now. It won't be because of, like, these very minor kind of, like, public gift scandals. It will be because they were elected to kind of fix Britain, to fix public services, and they don't do any of that.
Politics Joe's Ava Santina says Starmer seemed more relaxed than ever, but there are still issues he hasn't quite shaken off.
Well, do you know what was interesting? This was actually the most anecdotal I think we've heard him, possibly the most relaxed we've heard him. There were a few paintings of pictures that he did. A sort of, you know, there was a tableau of the time he went back to his childhood holiday home and had an interesting interaction with a woman there who was actually apparently rather rude to him and tried to push him down the stairs. Quite funny. Quite unusual for Starmer. He's not usually that candid. In terms of policy, look, I mean, they're still hammering home this line that the Conservatives have left the country in such a rut that we're all going to have to be in it together, get together and suffer a little bit in pain before we're going to see any benefit, before we're going to see those sunlit uplands, the brilliant economy, the sparkling economy that we've been promised for some time, that they promised us throughout the election. But, you know, there is this undercurrent at conference, which is the donations furor. People are upset that a very wealthy man, one of the top 10%, one of the top 1% of earners in this country, is having to receive donations in order to pay for his clothes. He also had a very successful career as a lawyer before. He was at the top of his game. You would imagine he would have some sort of wardrobe left over from that. Meanwhile, while they're justifying that, they're arguing that they can't lift the 2-child benefit cap and that they're going to have to take away pensioners' winter fuel payments. It's not really the sort of wartime spirit of we're in this suffering together that he wants to portray.
Starmer's beginning to life in government has not been perfect, and nobody expected it to be. This gathering hasn't really pushed things forward, but he'll perhaps be simply grateful it didn't drag his party backwards.
The state of play at the end of conference is much the same as it was at the beginning. Labour can't make everyone happy right away, but people want to feel like they will be happier eventually. The message at last year's conference was things can only get better. This year, you really get the sense that people want that change to begin.